My mother has a specific tone she uses right before she says something cruel. It's light, almost cheerful, like she's about to tell you the weather. That was the tone she used when she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "You're not welcome at the wedding." I didn't see her face, but I didn't need to. I've known that smirk since I was 7 years old. It lives in her voice, in the small pause right before the sentence lands, like she's giving you a second to brace yourself before she doesn't. "Good to know," I said. I hung up before she could say anything else. Here's what nobody would have guessed, watching me set my phone down and go back to loading the dishwasher. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't even that surprised. What I was doing, if I'm being honest, was math. Because somewhere in an account my mother didn't know existed, there was a very specific number attached to that wedding. $4,200. And she had just uninvited the one person who knew exactly where it came from. She thought she was the one hanging up on me. She had no idea what she'd just done. But to understand why 4 words could carry that much weight, you need to know who I'd been to this family for the last 10 years. My name is Renee. I'm 36, the older of 2 daughters, and for most of my life I've had a job that suits me a little too well. I manage operations for a distribution company, which is a professional way of saying I make sure things run smoothly when everyone else assumes they just will. That's more or less been my role at home, too. In my family, there's always been a shorthand. Chloe is the sweet one. I'm the responsible one. Nobody ever sat us down and assigned those labels, but by the time I was in my 20s, they'd hardened into something like fact. Being the responsible one meant I was the daughter who drove my mother to her cardiology appointments because Chloe got too anxious in waiting rooms. It meant that 2 years ago, when my mother's electric bill went unpaid for 3 months and she mentioned it once, almost in passing, I quietly covered it before it became a conversation. Nobody thanked me exactly. It wasn't that kind of family. It was more that the bill got paid, and life continued, and I went back to being someone nobody had to think about. I used to think if I just kept showing up, eventually I'd stop being the option and start being the favorite. I was wrong about that for a very long time. Nobody in my family has ever asked how I'm doing. They ask what I can do. I stopped noticing the difference somewhere along the way. So when Chloe called me in tears about the wedding venue, I didn't think twice. That should have been my first warning. Chloe called me on a Thursday night, crying so hard I could barely understand her. The venue she and Mark had fallen in love with, Hollow Creek Barn, needed a $4,200 deposit within 48 hours, or they'd lose the date. They didn't have it. Between the ring, the dress, and Mark's car needing new brakes, they were tapped out. "Please don't tell Mom," she said, before she'd even asked me for anything. "You know how she gets about money. She'll make the whole wedding about this instead of about us." I told her not to worry about it. I wired the deposit that night, before I'd even finished thinking it through, the way I always have. By the end of the week, I was the one exchanging emails with the coordinator, a woman named Elena, confirming dates and deposit schedules while Chloe forwarded me screenshots of centerpieces. I didn't mind. It felt good, actually, being trusted with something that mattered to her. A few days later, at Sunday dinner, my mother mentioned, almost as an aside while passing the potatoes, that Aunt Carol was keeping an eye on things this year. She said it the way you'd mention the weather might turn. No weight behind it, no explanation offered. I asked what she meant. She just waved a hand and said something about wanting the wedding to go smoothly for once, and moved on to asking Chloe about flowers. I didn't think about that comment again for almost 2 weeks. I wish I had. 2 weeks later, at Chloe's bridal shower, I found out exactly what my mother and my aunt had been keeping an eye on. The shower was at my cousin's house, string lights, mimosas, a table of gifts wrapped in pale green paper. I was refilling the ice bucket when Aunt Carol said it, loud enough for the women near the dessert table to hear. "Well, I just think some people should be more careful with what isn't theirs." She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The room did that small, quiet shift rooms do when everyone understands something except the person it's about. A few relatives glanced my way, and then very deliberately didn't. I stood there holding a bag of ice, waiting for someone to explain the joke. No one did. I found my mother in the kitchen afterward and asked her, quietly, what that was about. "Let it go," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "For Chloe's sake." It's her day coming up, I don't want drama. That was the moment I understood she'd already heard whatever this was. Not just heard it, sat with it, long enough to decide it wasn't worth correcting. 2 days later, she called. Her voice was businesslike, almost brisk, like she was confirming a dentist appointment. I've been thinking about the wedding, she said. With everything going on with your aunt's side, I think it's better if you don't come. Just to keep things smooth. I didn't ask what everything meant. I could hear it in her voice anyway, the small, satisfied lift at the end of the sentence, the sound of a woman who'd made a decision and felt good about making it. Good to know, I said. I hung up before she could hear what I already knew, that she'd just made a decision she didn't have all the facts for. I told myself I was fine. It took about 6 hours for that to fall apart. The calm lasted about as long as it took me to load the dishwasher. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and let myself actually think about what had just happened. I started doing the math again, except this time it wasn't dollars. It was years. The Tuesday I missed my own department's award dinner because my mother had a skin scheduled and no one else could drive her. The 3 months of her electric bill. The nights I stayed on the phone with her doctors so she wouldn't have to explain her own symptoms twice. None of it had ever been a loan I expected repaid. I just thought, somewhere underneath all of it, I was building something. A place at the table that couldn't be taken back. Apparently it could. Apparently it always could have been. I picked up my phone to text Chloe. I got as far as "Did you know, Mom?" before I stopped myself and deleted it. She was 2 weeks from her wedding. She didn't need to be caught between us, and some old, tired part of me still didn't want to be the sister who made things harder. I thought about just letting it go. That was usually how this worked. I'd feel this exact ache for a day or two, then find some way to explain it away, and by the following Sunday I'd be back at that table anyway, quieter than before, a little more careful. Every time I'd ever tried to hold a boundary with my mother, I was the one who ended up apologizing first. I almost talked myself out of everything that happened next. What stopped me was a phone call I hadn't planned on getting. It came from Elena, the wedding coordinator, and she wasn't calling about anything I expected. Elena's voice was cheerful in the ordinary, professional way of someone who calls 3 brides a week and has no idea she's about to say something that will land like a small earthquake. "Hi, Renee, just following up on the Hollow Creek balance," she said. "We've got the final total at $6,800, due in 10 days. I have the card on file from the deposit. Do you want me to go ahead and run that automatically, or would you prefer to handle it manually this time?" I sat there for a second, phone against my ear in my own kitchen, and understood something with a kind of clarity that almost felt like static. I was still the contact. I was still the name on the contract. I was still, as far as Hollow Creek Barn was concerned, the person responsible for making sure my sister's wedding happened, at a wedding I had just been told, in plain words, that I wasn't welcome to attend. "Can I get back to you in a few days?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Of course, no rush. Just don't want you charged for a late fee," Elena said, already moving on to something else in her day. I hung up and stared at the wall for a while. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Chloe. A photo of her in her dress at the second fitting, veil pinned crooked, grinning like she'd never been happier in her life. 9 days. Can you believe it? She'd written, followed by 3 exclamation points and a string of hearts. She had no idea. That was obvious now, looking at that photo. Whatever conversation had happened between our mother and Aunt Carol, whatever version of events had made its way around that shower, none of it had reached Chloe yet. As far as she knew, I was still coming. As far as she knew, everything was fine. I could tell her right now. One text, and she'd know everything our mother had done. Or I could wait and let her find out the way I had, the hard way, from someone who wasn't supposed to be the one telling her. For the first time since that phone call with my mother, I understood exactly how much power I still had. I just didn't know yet if I wanted to use it. That question got a lot more complicated 3 days later, when I finally found out where Aunt Carol's story had actually come from. The message came from my cousin Danielle, 3 days later, dropped into our usual text thread, like it was nothing. "Hey, random question, are you okay? Heard you and Aunt Linda got into it over money. Carol was telling everyone at the shower you borrowed like a huge amount from her years ago and never paid it back. LOL, family drama never ends. I read it twice. Then a third time, slower, like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Because I remembered that transaction. I remembered it with a kind of clarity I don't usually have for things that happened 2 years ago. It was a Thursday in March. My mother had called me, quiet and ashamed in a way I'd rarely heard from her, and told me she'd missed a mortgage payment and didn't know what she was going to do. I'd transferred her $3,000 that same night. She'd asked me, specifically, not to mention it to anyone, not Chloe, not Aunt Carol, no one. I don't want anyone thinking I can't manage my own life, she'd said. I'd agreed, because that seemed like a small thing to give her. Somewhere between that Thursday and this bridal shower, the story had turned completely inside out. I hadn't borrowed money from my mother and failed to pay it back. I'd given her money and never mentioned it again. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. I had the bank transfer sitting in an app on my phone. All I had to do was decide what I wanted to do with the truth. What I didn't know yet was whether my mother had told that story herself, shrunk down and softened into something that made her look less desperate, only for it to grow teeth on its way through Aunt Carol. Or whether she knew exactly what version was circulating and had simply let it stand. I didn't confront anyone yet. First, I needed to understand exactly what my mother had let happen and why. I spent that evening at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling back through old texts like I was building a case file, which I suppose, in a way, I was. March, 2 years ago. My mother's message, short and clipped in a way that wasn't like her. Can you call me? I need help with something, and I don't want to say it over text. Then the phone call, then the transfer, then her follow-up text an hour later. Thank you. Please don't say anything to your aunt. She'll never let me hear the end of it. I remembered the dinner, weeks ago, when she'd mentioned Aunt Carol keeping an eye on things this year, tossed off like nothing. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now. At some point between that transfer and this wedding, my mother had told her sister some version of what happened, a version, I guessed, where she wasn't the one who'd needed rescuing. Maybe she'd said I'd borrowed from her instead. Maybe Carol had heard something vague and filled in the rest herself. Either way, my mother had let it happen, and she'd let it grow, because the alternative was admitting to her sister that she'd once been $3,000 from losing her house. I called her, not to accuse her, just to ask. Did you tell Carol I borrowed money from you? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear the television playing behind her, some show she wasn't really watching anymore. It's not that simple, she finally said. That's not a no. You're twisting this into something it isn't. She never said the words. She didn't have to. The pause had already told me everything the sentence wouldn't. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, then finally opened the voicemail she'd left 3 days earlier, the one I'd let sit unheard because I hadn't wanted to hear her voice yet. It wasn't what I expected. She didn't sound cold or businesslike, the way she had on the phone about the wedding. She sounded smaller. Renee, it's me. I don't know. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Call me back. She still thought this was about keeping the peace with her sister. She had no idea it was about to cost her the wedding. That night, I had to make a decision I couldn't undo. I want to be clear about what I decided to do that night, because it would have been easy to do something else. I could have called the venue and canceled everything out of spite. I could have sent Chloe a long message laying out every detail, forcing her to choose a side before her own wedding. I thought about both briefly and let them go. That wasn't who I wanted to be in this. What I did instead was open my laptop and write an email to Elena. Hi Elena, following up on our call. I need to step back as the financial guarantor and main point of contact on the Hollow Creek contract, effective immediately. I've included Linda's and Chloe's information below as the new responsible parties for the remaining balance. Thank you for everything so far. I know the wedding will be beautiful. I read it 3 times before I sent it. It felt strange how calm it looked on the screen, considering what it actually meant. I didn't call my mother to tell her. I didn't text Chloe to explain. I thought about it and then I decided against it on purpose. If I told them myself, it would look like a threat, like I was forcing a reaction. I didn't want that. I wanted the truth to reach them the way truth usually does in families like mine, sideways, through paperwork and phone calls nobody expected, not through me standing in the middle of it explaining myself again. I closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, like I'd finally stopped holding my breath. It took 4 days for the first crack to show. It started with a text from Chloe I wasn't expecting. Chloe's name came up on my screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up anyway. Renee. Her voice was already shaking. Renee, Elena just emailed me and Mom about the billing thing, and there's this whole payment history attached, and it says the deposit came from your account, back in. She stopped, like she'd lost the sentence. You paid it. You've been the one paying for all of this. This whole time. Yes, I said. And you're the guarantor. On the contract. Still. Right now. I withdrew a few days ago, I said. Elena has your information now and Mom's, for the rest of the balance. There was a silence on the line, the kind where I could almost hear her working through it in real time, the deposit, the contract, the timing of it all, lining up against a phone call she must have already heard about from someone at that dinner table. Mom banned you from the wedding, she said slowly, and she didn't even know you were the one holding it together financially. No, I said. She didn't. I should have told her where the deposit came from, Chloe said, and now her voice had a different shake to it, something closer to guilt. I let her think Mark's parents covered it. I didn't want another fight about money before the wedding, so I just let her believe it. I didn't think it would matter this much. I didn't say anything right away. Some old part of me wanted to tell her it was fine, the way I always did. I let the silence sit instead. Did you know Mom banned me before you found out about the money? I asked. I didn't know either thing until about 10 minutes ago, she said, and I believed her. I paid it, I said finally. I withdrew as guarantor. I didn't tell you, or Mom on purpose, because I didn't want it to sound like a threat. I wanted you both to find out the way you just did. I could hear my sister realizing, in real time, exactly what our mother had done, and exactly who had actually been holding this wedding together. Linda called 40 minutes later. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Renee, I just saw the email. I swear I didn't know that was your money. I know you didn't, I said. That's kind of the point. This isn't what it looks like. I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to keep things calm with your aunt. You know how she gets. Mom. I kept my voice even. Can I just say something, and you let me finish? She stopped. I don't think she expected that. I paid for a wedding I wasn't allowed to attend. I got blamed for owing you money, when it was the other way around. I gave you $3,000 2 years ago and never told a single person because you asked me not to. And you let Aunt Carol believe whatever version made you look better, and when it came time to choose between defending me and keeping the peace with her, you chose her. You didn't even ask me my side. You just decided. Silence on the line. I could hear her breathing uneven. I'm not angry about the money, I said, and I meant it. Chloe and Mark can take over the balance. I hope the wedding is everything she wants it to be. Renee, please come to the wedding. Obviously you're invited. Obviously this was all a misunderstanding. I'll call your aunt right now and straighten this out. No, I said. Renee, I don't want an invitation that only exists because you found out what I was worth to you. I wanted one before any of this happened. You didn't offer it then. For the first time in my life, my mother didn't have anything to say back to me. I let the silence sit there. I'd earned it. I have to go, Mom, I said, and I meant that too in more ways than one. The wedding still happened. What happened around it is the part one didn't expect. I wasn't there, so most of what I know came secondhand in pieces from people who assumed I'd want the full report. Chloe and Mark ended up covering the rest of the balance themselves, closer to $7,000 than they'd ever planned on spending, which meant cutting the flowers back and skipping the photo booth Chloe had wanted since college. Nobody sabotaged anything. There was just suddenly a gap where my quiet, invisible help used to be, and they had to fill it the hard way, the way people usually do when they find out how much someone else was absorbing without saying so. At the reception, more than one relative asked Chloe where I was. She didn't dodge it. From what I heard, she told a plain, short version of the truth. that Mom had excluded me over money I'd actually given, not taken, and that she hadn't found out until days before. Aunt Carol's story didn't survive contact with that. It's hard to keep insisting someone stole from the family once the person's own daughter is showing people a payment history that says otherwise. My mother, from what I understand, spent most of that week fielding a version of the discomfort she'd handed me 2 weeks earlier, smaller, quieter, but real. A few days before the wedding, she texted me. Not an apology, not exactly. More like the edge of one, worn thin. I've been thinking about everything. I didn't handle this the way I should have. Nothing more specific than that. I heard about all of it after the fact, from people who assumed I'd want to know. What surprised me was how little I actually needed to. The wedding came and went. What stayed with me was everything that changed after it. The weeks after the wedding looked different in small, quiet ways. Chloe started calling just to talk, not "can you," not "would you mind," just "how's your week going?" The first time she did it, I almost asked what she needed before I caught myself. My mother and I had one real conversation, a few weeks later, over coffee that went mostly cold while neither of us said much. She didn't offer a full accounting of everything. She said she'd let Carol's version stand because admitting the truth meant admitting how scared she'd been about the mortgage, and that felt easier to hand off than to own. It wasn't a complete apology. It was more honest than anything she'd said to me in years, and for now, that was enough to sit with. I noticed something else, too, smaller but maybe more important. My phone would ring, an unfamiliar hour, my mother's name on the screen, and I didn't feel that old drop in my stomach anymore, that automatic bracing for whatever I was about to be asked to fix. Some of it, I let go to voicemail. Not out of spite. Just because I finally trusted that I didn't have to answer every single time to still be someone worth loving. I used to think love was something you earned by being useful. I don't think that anymore. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone who's ever been the one everyone counts on but no one truly counts in, it's this. I think about that smirk sometimes, the sound of it more than the sight of it, since I never actually saw her face. I think she meant it to put me back in the place I'd always occupied in that family, useful, dependable, and quietly unwanted. Instead, it turned out to be the moment I finally stopped standing in that place. I don't regret paying for that wedding. I'd probably do it again, honestly, because helping Chloe was never really the problem. And I don't regret walking away from it either. Once it became clear that my help and my presence were two very different things to my mother, one she wanted, one she didn't. Both of those choices were true to who I am. I don't think I have to pick one and call the other a mistake. People sometimes think strength has to sound like a speech. It doesn't. Sometimes it's just 4 words, said calmly, that mean exactly what they say and nothing more. Good to know. I didn't need her to apologize anymore. I just needed to stop waiting for it. If you've ever had to let go of a family that never chose you back, I think you understand exactly why those 3 words felt like the strongest thing I've ever said.